If God is just, then why give the eternal punishment of hell for temporal sin?
Thank you.
Glad we could do your question.
Thank you for that question. It's a really, really good one, and not just the question about hell, but that idea of eternal punishment for temporal sin. I see that distinction in your question, and it makes it a harder question, and I appreciate that. Let me start off, if it's all right, because I can continue on from what I was saying. I think sometimes we vastly underestimate our sin and its consequences in this life. You know, sometimes when I try to explain the idea of sin to people, they want to say to me, well, really, you're exaggerating. You're not too bad. It's not like you've killed anyone. Well, I just told you that story of the guy from my childhood who went on to commit suicide. So if you ask me that question, have I killed anyone, that's actually a much more difficult question for me to answer than you might think it is. And then what are the consequences of the way I use my free will in his life, him taking his life? What did that do in the context of his family? What will that do in the context of the future generations to come? It's sobering to think about that. You know, sometimes I can look back on my life as a teenager right now and say, man, I thought at the time that was no big deal, but the reality was that was truly terrible. Well, any progress I have made in life, it's about that much. Imagine how far along this path God would be. Imagine if the standard is not someone you see on the 6 o'clock news who has done something worse than you so you can feel better about yourself. What if the standard is a perfectly holy God? A perfectly holy God who loves each one of us. What would our sin look like from his perspective? And the multiplying and the exponential effects of that sin. Maybe Jesus gives us an idea in some of his statements that lust would look like adultery, that unjust anger would look like murder. So temporal sin, eternal punishment, when I think about the reality of my sin, I don't see the gap the way you might initially presume that it is there. But now let's talk just briefly about this idea of hell itself. How are we to understand this idea? I think one of the best ways to understand it is in a relational framework. Jesus invites us into relationship with himself. A relationship can only be entered into if both people say yes to that relationship. If we are not willing to say yes to that relationship, then there's nothing that Jesus can do on his side. Sometimes people say, why is Jesus the only way to heaven? And I answer, well, because Jesus is heaven. That's what heaven is. Why is Jesus the only way to eternal life? Well, because Jesus is eternal life. Flourishing relationship with the God who created you and desires to be in friendship and relationship with you more than anything. That's what eternal life is. It's not just some theme park that we get a ticket to and then we can go or decide not to go. It is the relationship itself. And that's why someone like Christopher Hitchens said, heaven would be hell for me. Why? Because he doesn't want to be with God. Because he said that explicitly at one point in his life. People like Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, they say, I don't want to be with God. It would be an invasion of my privacy. It would take away my autonomy. That's not attractive to me. Well, if that's not attractive to you, then God is not going to force you to be with him. And being apart from him in the context of eternity, that's what we call hell. It's interesting that the Bible uses a phrase when it refers to hell at times. It talks about weeping and gnashing of teeth. That may seem like a very harsh phrase to you, and it always did to me as well. But in my family, we've dealt with a lot of estrangement. At one time, 2 uncles of mine, they didn't speak for about 7 years. But I have a vivid memory of the 2 of them being at a wedding together. They both had to be at this wedding. They had to be in each other's physical presence and yet relationally estranged. And you know what I saw on their faces? Literally weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is the natural reaction to being in the presence of someone who you know full well you're supposed to be family with, the person who is supposed to love you most, the person you were intended to be in the deepest friendship with, and knowing that there's nothing other than your own stubbornness that keeps you from being together with them. That all it would have taken on either side, just one of my uncles, to say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? and that relationship would have been restored. And it is the same with God. He will not force that upon us, but if we will just say, I'm sorry, there is nothing he desires more deeply than relationship with each one of us.
Well done. You know, it's fascinating when we're asked questions like this, we ask them of ourselves too. We often think of these questions and struggle with it. When you read the story of the younger son going out and squandering all the father's wealth and returning, there are always surprises in Jesus' stories. In fact, many of you may know the name of Nabil Qureshi, who passed away, my colleague. He and I were in the process of co-authoring a book. And with Nabil gone, Abdul Murray has taken that role now, and he and I are writing a book on the whole life of Christ through Eastern eyes. When you listen to the stories of Jesus, there are surprises in them that are both explicit and extended. You don't expect that story to end that way. The younger boy coming home, I come from the East. If I'd taken my portion of the wealth, my dad didn't have much, but if I'd taken it and gone and squandered it and then returned, I know what my dad would have done. Tell him to come right here and fall on his face, and I want to talk to that boy. But the story surprisingly ends in two ways you don't expect. The first is that the father gathers his robes and he runs outside to welcome the son back. That's the grace of God extended in the gospel message, which is very unique. Please hear me now. In every other worldview, salvation is earned. Your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds. Your righteousness has to exceed your unrighteousness. Your karma has to be paid. Only in the gospel message is salvation a gift, the gift of grace, unmerited by you. So the Father comes out. The Father comes out to receive the Son. That's a surprise in the Eastern story. But there's a second surprise. There's an older brother who's pretty upset. He said, what's this? I've been here all along, and he's the boy who's getting the party. What do I need to do? You see, he's the one who had never enjoyed the love of the Father, even though he lived under the same roof. He never got to break free from his own selfishness to enjoy the love of the Father. I say to you, to somebody who doesn't want God, even heaven would be hell for that person. Goodness would be an angering thing to the individual. All I can tell you is this: if any man comes unto me, Jesus says, I will in no wise cast him out. You have the opportunity to come to him. If you desire not to be with him, he will second your motion, and that is a choice you make for time and eternity. There's a younger boy who repents. There's an older boy who's in the house but never really enjoys being with the dad. You and I can fall into one of those two categories.